Well, good morning, Arvada. It is so good to have you all with us this morning. My name is Christine Jensen. I'm a past chair of the Arvada Chamber of Commerce. Our faithful leader, Cami Welch, is working her way through some technology issues this morning, and Cami may be jumping on and joining us in a few moments. But in the meantime, I get the honor of getting us all started and underway. We're so happy that you could be here for our monthly Emerging Conversations webinar on this month's topic, Understanding Inflation. And this event is part of a new series that the Chamber of Commerce is offering to ensure that we provide ample opportunities for our entire community to understand the issues and opportunities that'll make sure that Arvada continues to be an incredible place to live, work, and play. Certainly, we recognize that we may all have a little bit of Zoom fatigue. I know Cammie's certainly wishing she didn't this morning, but we certainly are grateful for a platform that makes it possible for us to be able to create conversations and share more widely the recording of this event in the coming weeks. So please feel free to use the chat function if you have questions that you'd like to ask and engage in the conversation. And after the webinar, we're going to move the conversation to Mighty Network, the new platform, so exciting, where you can continue to share thoughts and ideas for our community. And I think Ryan or one of our teammates here is going to drop a link in the chat for Mighty Networks. So I want to take a moment to thank our elected officials that have joined us today. From the Arvada City Council, I think we have potentially Lisa Smith and Randy Moorman and Lauren Simpson with us this morning. Welcome to our Arvada City Council members. We appreciate you being with us. From the Jefferson County Board of Commissioners, we have Commissioner Andy Kerr, Commissioner Leslie Dahlkemper, and Commissioner Tracy Kraftharp. Thank you to our partners at Jeffco for joining us. We're so grateful to have you here. From the Arvada Fire Board this morning, we have Bob Loveridge and Andrea Romero. Guys, thank you for serving in the way that you do. It's really so helpful for our community when we have partners and teammates that step up to serve in the way that they do. So, so grateful that you can all be with us. Now, it's possible that I may have missed an elected official or two. So if you are an elected official and you are with us this morning, would you please drop your name and your greeting into the chat box, because we definitely want to make sure we hear from you. All right, and certainly programs like this are made possible by our annual sponsors. So allow me to thank the annual sponsors that make not only programs like this possible, but just the entire operation of the Arvada Chamber of Commerce. And certainly we are very thankful for an annual partnership with the Community First Foundation on our time for another cup of coffee, I guess, for our Emerging Conversations webinar series, and certainly our State of series. We have a couple of community impact forums that are coming up. You'll be able to see those on your screen now. Some of the programs are in person. Some of the programs are online, and certainly the ones that you see on your screen right now are the ones that you'll be able to join in an online format. And what's cool about these is that they are at no additional cost for the chamber members. So make sure you spread the word far and wide and join us for the Emerging Conversation series. All right, and then we've got a couple of chamber updates. We've got some cool things going on. Cami, are you able to talk about the chamber updates, or would you like me to go ahead and spread the word on that? Well, while we're waiting for Cami to join us, let me talk to you about a couple of exciting things that we have going on. the Arvada Business Pulse Survey. You're going to be receiving notifications on that, so take a look. Lots of fun for us to be able to talk about some of the other topics that are important to our chamber members. We also have our badass women of Arvada, tons of fun, highlighting, as you see on the screen, Kate with the Arvada Police Department. So excited to have an opportunity to share some information about that. Our Leadership Boot Camp program is going to be coming up very soon. If you have not yet registered or gotten some information about Leadership Boot Camp, oh my goodness, so many great resources to be able to learn what's happening in Arvada, to be able to learn some leadership skills, to get an opportunity to be exposed to different components of our community. So make sure you take a look at the promotions and the emails that are coming out regarding that. And so excited that we are currently accepting nominations for Man and Woman of the Year, the Young Professional Leaders, and the Rising Star. You know, it's really great for us to be able to spotlight some of the greatest talents and the most exemplary leaders that we have here in Arvada. So be sure to share the names and nomination details on anybody that you think would make an exceptional recipient of one of those awards. So with that, I want to go ahead and officially welcome you to our emerging conversation today, where we're going to be talking about how inflation is impacting our, how inflation is impacting all of us. I think, like you, we're all feeling that that this conversation is becoming more and more critical for us to understand. Just this past week, the Fed raised rates once again, and we've been hearing about the impact of inflation. So today we're going to guide you through an improved understanding of inflation and what we can expect in the near future. We're going to start with a keynote address to help us better understand the issue, and then we're going to move to a panel discussion with incredible industry experts who will help us better understand the impact of inflation. We are certain you're going to walk away with an improved understanding. So allow me to introduce our keynote presenter this morning. Matthew Kukla is with Syntrinsic. Matt joined Syntrinsic in 2022 as a senior research analyst with a particular focus on private markets and alternative assets, including venture capital, private equity, hedge funds, real estate, and private debt. He's responsible for researching investment managers, developing capital market expectations, and constructing client portfolios. But prior to joining Syntrinsic, Matt has worked in a variety of roles throughout the financial spectrum, including a sell-side equity analysis, buy-side portfolio management, international finance, high net worth banking, consulting, and data analytics. Matt graduated magna cum laude from Cleveland State University with a bachelor's degree in finance and is a chartered financial analyst level 3 candidate. A native of Cleveland, Ohio, Matt spends much of his time reading literature on money, banking, finance, and economics. Makes him a very interesting human being. He also enjoys deep thinking and writing in his journals. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks, Christine. It's a pleasure to have me. I just want to make sure everything is working correctly. So good morning, everyone. It is an honor and privilege to be the keynote speaker for the Arvada Chamber of Commerce Emerging Conversations webinar. My name is Matthew Kukla. I'm a senior analyst at Syntrinsic Investment Counsel. As Christine mentioned, in today's Emerging Conversations presentation, the focus is on understanding inflation. I'm going to discuss the types of inflation and their causes, provide a historical perspective of inflation, outline the drivers of today's current inflationary environment and how we think it will evolve over the course of 2022 and 2023, discuss measures to mitigate inflation for small businesses, how to hedge and allocate an investment portfolio for inflation. And as Christine mentioned, after the presentation, there's going to be a panel Q&A session for attendees to participate. So inflation has really dominated headlines lately, and it's really top of mind among the investment community and households. And I think this is for a good reason, considering that current inflation rates are near 40-year highs and at approximately 8%. In simple terms, inflation is really a hidden tax that essentially reduces purchasing power, requiring a trade-off in the portfolio of consumption among
Matt, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Do you
Yeah.
mind trying to share your screen one more time? We're not seeing your PowerPoint.
Oh, you're not seeing the PowerPoint? Okay.
No, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me though?
We hear you great. Thank you.
Okay. Can you see it now?
We can see it. We just need you to flip it into the PowerPoint mode.
Oh, it's not on the right screen. Second. Which screen do you see? The one that I'm moving?
We see the kind of design version of it. So if you go up to from the beginning in that upper left corner, we should be able to see it.
Okay. Oh, let's see. Did that work?
It did not. Why don't we just go this way and just flip through it in this version and we'll keep moving.
Oh, flip through it in this version? Okay. Let's just try this out. Sorry about that. Okay. All right, I'll start. So inflation, as I mentioned, it's really dominated headlines lately, and it is top of mind among the investment community and households. I think this is for a good reason, considering that current inflation rates are near historic 40-year highs at approximately 8%. In simple terms, inflation is really a hidden tax that essentially reduces purchasing power, requiring a trade-off in the portfolio of consumption patterns for different entities, including households, businesses, and governments. While almost everyone is familiar with traditional goods and services inflation, given its tangibility and impact on wallets, there are actually two types of inflation that I am going to discuss. The two types of inflation are asset price inflation and goods and services inflation. In order to understand asset price inflation and goods and services inflation, it's important to understand the difference between the real economy and the financial economy and how the two are tethered together. Asset price inflation impacts the financial economy, whereas goods and services inflation impacts the real economy. Asset price inflation is really driven by central banks' quantitative easing policies and or speculation. While asset price inflation may be a financial economy phenomenon, it has the ability to impact goods and services inflation in the real economy when it is monetized and transmitted into the real economy. So the monetization of asset price inflation can occur when either the assets are sold, borrowing against the assets, or the wealth effect. And to get a little more granular, the wealth effect essentially leads to an increase in perceived wealth. And this increase in perceived wealth can cause an increase in spending from your current income and cash flow, a drawdown in savings that are then spent, or an increase in borrowings on credit. But I would note that there is a limitation to the potential impact on goods and services inflation from the wealth effect, just given the marginal propensity to consume among the entities that I mentioned, such as households, businesses, and governments. This is the traditional form of inflation that most people are familiar with. is an increase in the price of goods and services in the real economy because it impacts purchasing power and budgets and requires trade-offs. Goods and services inflation is particularly harsh for lower income households. This is especially true when you look at increases in inflation at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, such as food, energy, and shelter, as this causes the greatest strain on budgets. While many believe inflation is solely a monetary phenomenon, I believe this is inherently untrue. Goods and services inflation is impacted by demand, supply, structure, and monetary factors. And I have a range of them listed below, but you have demand pull, where demand is greater than potential output. You have supply side and supply chain shocks. There could be multiple layers within the supply chain leading to markups. You have monetary policy and depreciation of the currency for importing goods. There can be a lack of competition and available substitutes, a lack of innovative processes to drive efficiencies, a lack of economies of scale to drive operating leverage. Given the current environment, you have tariffs. There could be a lack of trade among entities with comparative advantages. There could also be a lack of investment in R&D, innovation, to expand potential output and the production possibilities frontier. And there's also increased uncertainty and expectations for future inflation. This is also referred to as adaptive expectations, and this can create reinforcing feedback loops for inflation. This is a depiction of the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is a measure of inflation based on a basket of goods and services. I chose this chart because it is essentially consistent with our outlook for 2022, where we think inflation will peak in 1H 2022 and moderate over the course of the year. But as a caveat, we think it will remain above the Fed's targeted 2% inflation rate. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the CPI measures inflation based on a basket of goods and services. And as can be seen, this is a weighting of the CPI baskets. What I think is particularly important is that more than 60% of inflationary pressure comes from four sources. And that's housing, food, recreation / culture, and transport. The next 6 slides that I'm going to share provide a historical context of post-World War II inflation, where inflation was greater than or equal to 5%. I think the historical context is important as it can provide a point of reference and frame expectations as to our current inflationary environment. As can be seen, post-World War II inflation jumped over 20%. It was driven by the elimination of price controls, shortages, supply shortages, and pent-up demand. And the particular dynamics of post-World War II inflation are probably the closest analog to what we are facing today, although it's not perfect. I think Mark Twain said it best when he said, "History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes." This is the period of the Korean War, where inflation reached 10%. This was caused by demand pull inflation. There were also shortages due to military spending and price controls. What I think is particularly interesting is that when price controls were lifted during this period, inflation did not spike as it did immediately post-World War II. During this period, March 1969 and January 1971, we see that inflation was near 6%. And this was driven by a booming economy as GDP averaged roughly 5% until President Nixon instituted a freeze on wages and prices. This is really a textbook example of demand pull inflation. Oddly enough, Many people are referencing this particular period of inflation to today. However, I think this is the incorrect analog, as I don't think demand is greater than potential output, and it also doesn't take into consideration supply side factors. The 10 to 15% rates of inflation in the 70s and early 80s was caused by surges in oil prices. Now, the first was caused by OPEC's oil embargo, and the second was caused by a decline in oil production due to the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. During the 1989, May 91 period, inflation was above 5%, and this was really due to increased uncertainty regarding crude oil shocks as a result of Iraq invading Kuwait, leading to the first Gulf War. And really, this is similar to the increase in oil prices to $140 a barrel we recently saw, given expectations of a potential supply side shock in oil due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While short-lived, this period of inflation from July of 2008 to August of 2008, this period of 5% inflation was also caused by oil increasing to $140 a barrel, similar to what we saw earlier this year. So this brings us to the present day, where inflation currently stands at roughly 8%. As mentioned above, this period more closely resembles the immediate post-World War II period as opposed to the 1970s. Today's inflation was driven really by a confluence of factors on the demand and supply side, including you had fiscal stimulus, you had monetary stimulus, there was pent-up demand, historical savings rates, spending on goods versus services, the wealth effect, supply chain constraints and bottlenecks, shortages of some goods, as well as rising labor costs. So what happens next? I don't have a crystal ball, but based on the immediate post-World War II historical context, we do know that rates of inflation do not persist indefinitely. We think additional fiscal stimulus is unlikely. We know the Fed is implementing a tightening cycle, and household savings have been drawn down back to historical levels. So historically, these factors will tend to dampen demand. We also see that economies are opening up post-COVID, and there's increased hiring, which should reduce supply chain constraints as well. So we expect inflation to moderate over the course of 2022, as I mentioned previously, but we do think it'll be above the Fed's targeted 2% inflation rate, but we do think it will begin to normalize in 2023 and probably be more in line with the Fed's targeted 2% inflation rate during that time. As a big caveat, I would say our expectations would really change dramatically should a supply shock occur from the Russian-Ukraine war. So what does this mean for your business? The factors impacting inflation today are pretty much exogenous in nature for small businesses. How inflation impacts small businesses is it's really a function of revenue and the cost structure and how this is translated to the P&L. Ultimately, a business has three options. You can either pass on costs to customers, reduce costs, or absorb costs impacting margins. On the revenue side, a business can raise prices or change its product mix to offset inflation, as long as it doesn't sacrifice customers. So there really is a limitation to what can be done to a degree on the revenue side. There is more of an ability to reduce costs and mitigate inflation, as we'll see. This isn't really an exhaustive list, but some of the ways small businesses can mitigate inflation on the cost side include R&D and innovation, improving productivity and processes, automating wherever possible, bundling, forming group buy purchasing networks for procurement, simplifying the supply chain, as well as refinancing debt. When we look at the capital markets currently, what we see as a backdrop is high equity valuations with an expectation for increased volatility and negative real yields of fixed income given the current inflationary environment. Together, all of this bodes well for private markets and some alternative asset allocations. We still think it remains important to focus on long-term asset allocations within the context of risk-return preferences with a focus on quality, because we found quality tends to be a buffer in down markets. We would still maintain allocations to equity with the focus on quality. We would focus on short duration floating rate fixed income, and we would allocate to alternative investments such as private debt, real estate, and private equity, as these typically have lower correlations to traditional asset classes and provide diversification. And they also have the ability to outpace inflation as well. So as I mentioned on previous slides, we do not expect high rates of inflation to persist indefinitely. We expect inflation rates to moderate over the course of 2022, be around the Fed's targeted 2% inflation rate in 2023. Besides what's happening with the war in Russia and Ukraine, we are also closely monitoring the decline in the demographic dividend and decline in cheap labor from China for evidence of higher persistent inflation in labor, primarily due to worker shortages. And this idea was really espoused by the former UK central banker, Charles Goodhart. And for those interested, I've also included a link to the article in the Wall Street Journal that goes into deeper detail regarding this topic. I couldn't find a great spot in the presentation for the next two slides, so I simply included them as addendums at the end to discuss. Again, there are many references comparing today's inflation to the early 1970s inflation, and there are concerns over a wage price spiral. So I just wanted to touch on this briefly. I think a wage price spiral is unwarranted comparison, because I don't think demand is really exceeding potential output. Wages are increasing, but we're not seeing that they're essentially increasing at a slower pace versus inflation. And probably the most important factor, there's not embedded expectations of inflation lasting indefinitely among the populace, as most see it as temporary in nature. And really, those are the preconditions you would need to really see a wage price spiral. And lastly, given its pervasiveness in the headlines, substantial weighting in the CPI basket and impact on wallets, I wanted to touch on the rise in oil prices. The rise in oil prices is being driven by a multitude of factors. For starters, post the boom bust cycle in 2016 and demand destruction from COVID in 2020, the industry is no longer focused on growth at all costs, but rather on generating shareholder returns. I would say this factor coupled with The momentum of ESG has shortened investment time horizons. It's led to an underinvestment among shale oil players in the U.S. And what we're seeing is private operators leading drilling activity as opposed to public operators. Additionally, there's shortages of fracking sand, labor, and fracking equipment, and also the inventory of drillable wells is somewhat limited given the maturity of the shale oil patch, and 15 to 20% growth rates are really no longer feasible. I would say all of those factors, coupled with OPEC not releasing available reserves, has led to an increase in oil prices, while expectations of supply shocks due to the Russia-Ukraine war only exacerbated the increase in oil prices, although they have come down to roughly 100 a barrel from 140 a barrel. So this concludes my presentation. I would like to thank all the attendees in the audience, as well as the Arvada Chamber of Commerce for giving me the opportunity to present this morning. And with that, I'll hand it back to either Cami or Christine to lead us into the Q&A portion.
Well, thank you so much for that insightful presentation, Matt. Gosh, there are so many variables to consider. I know I was taking notes furiously while you were talking. But we're going to move into our panel discussion now, and I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. So we want to invite you to participate in the discussion. So if you have questions that you would like our panelists to tackle, be sure to type those into the chat box. We'd love to hear from you, but let's get underway now with our panelists. And so delighted to have with us today, for more of a national perspective from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, please help me welcome Mr. Curtis Dubé. Curtis Dubé is Senior Economist in the Economic Policy Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He tracks the condition of the economy, analyzes the impact of public policy on economic growth, and he runs the Chamber's Chief Economists Committee. The committee consists of chief economists from member businesses, and it helps the Chamber formulate economic policies and provides analysis to policymakers in Washington, D.C. Previously, Dubé was senior economist at the American Bankers Association, where he worked on tax issues and followed the economic trends affecting the banking industry. But prior to the ABA, he was a research fellow in tax and economic policy at the Heritage Foundation. There's much more that we want you to know about Mr. Dubé, so we're going to put a little more information about his background in the chat box. But again, please help me welcome Mr. Curtis Dubé. Representing a little more of a local perspective for us and an industry perspective, we have our own local expert here with us today in the restaurant and hospitality industry, our very own, the amazing Sean Kaiser. Sean Kaiser is an award-winning hospitality industry executive with more than 30 years experience in restaurant operations. He's a hands-on collaborative leader with passion and a reputation for developing high-performing teams that are dedicated to the execution of world-class quality and service standards. He's dedicated to creating exceptional dining experiences by promoting high-level guest engagement and top-quality community relationships. Sean and his wife Deborah are slated to be the primary operators of the new Legacy Point Bar and Grill, currently operated as Lodo's Bar and Grill, located up at 104th and Federal, I believe, in Westminster. He has served on the executive committee of the Colorado Restaurant Association Board of Directors, the Arvada Chamber Board, and as the past chairman of JCBEA and Westminster Chamber of Commerce. There's much more that we could tell you about the amazing Sean Kaiser, and we're going to put a little bit more information about him in the chat box as well. And then a very important industry to us all from a consumer perspective as well as a business perspective is the energy industry. So once again, we have a local expert here with us today to help us get our hands around the energy industry. Tyson Miller, who is the Chief Financial Officer at Hill Petroleum. in Arvada, Colorado, right around the corner from our office and the chamber office. This is Tyson's fourth year in this position after coming to Hill Petroleum from the government service, where his last position, he managed NATO programs for the U.S. Navy throughout Europe. Tyson is a results-driven finance and accounting executive with more than 20 years of progressive experience in finance, strategy, operations, and management in small companies to multinational organizations. He's also on the board of advisors for Greenfill LLC, one of the first eco-friendly liquefied soap dispensing systems for commercial laundry services, and he now resides in Fort Collins with his wife and 2 sons. Welcome, Tyson Miller. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being with us today. We certainly want to kind of tie together more of the academic explanations of economics that we heard in the keynote this morning. So I'd like to begin by tossing over to Sean, first of all, from your perspective. What is the impact on the restaurant industry that we're seeing from inflation right now?
Well, thank you for having me on today, Christine and the Arvada Chamber. This is really an important topic to discuss as people understand how this is going to affect them directly. In the restaurant industry, we've been impacted obviously by cost of goods and escalating price of commodities. But there's also the demand in the labor market that has impacted us through higher wages that we're having to pay, delivery charges, fuel charges, and a variety of other surpluses that surplus expenses that we haven't had to deal with in most recent years. And it's been a tough time on the restaurant industry over the last couple of years. And especially when it comes to the labor market and how we staff our restaurants and the industry as a whole. We've had to rely on technology that doesn't make us as dependent on hourly labor, just so we can satisfy the needs of our guests who are walking through the door and wanting to purchase our products.
Yep, certainly an important concern for all of us. And we heard during Mr. Kukla's presentation how business can respond. And you highlighted that perfectly from the restaurant industry. Tyson Miller, going to toss over to you right now from the energy industry vantage point. What are the impacts that you're seeing from inflation?
Well, inflation's impacting everybody, and it's going from the supplier all the way through to the end user. We're seeing higher freight costs for any of our incoming freight, so that cost is associated in the pricing that we have to put through to the customers. We have an increased wages these days just to remain competitive, especially with our drivers. Inflation has changed the way that we have to pay our administrative staff as well. That's increased significantly because we do want them to have a livable wage in which the inflation doesn't outpace their salaries. So it's increasing all of our costs kind of across the board. There's nothing that's really been that hasn't been impacted.
Yeah, for sure. It was, I found it really interesting during Mr. Kukla's presentation. He was talking about the increase in oil prices in the 70s, that there was certainly a surge in oil prices, but also the impact of a post-war economy. And we kind of see both of those right now with the war in Eastern Europe, as well as the increase in prices. But it's not just the price to consumers, it's the cost for companies like Hill Petroleum in their costs of operating. So let's use that as kind of a good launching point. Curtis, I'm going to toss it over to you because in Mr. Kukla's presentation, we heard that businesses can respond in a number of different ways. When there's inflation at our fingertips, they can respond by raising prices, improving productivity, passing the additional costs on to consumers. What are you seeing from more of a national business collective response to the inflation that we're beginning to experience right now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's a lot of things going on at once, and it's all contributing to much higher prices for consumers and much higher input costs for businesses. So we all know that we have a workforce shortage. So businesses, all of you who are running businesses know that you're having to pay people a heck of a lot more to get workers into your businesses to make your products or provide your services. Businesses are passing those extra labor costs on to consumers as much as they possibly can. Because there's a lot of expectations. It's a psychological thing when it comes to inflation, that if consumers, if we all expect inflation, we can get inflation because we're willing to pay higher prices because we were anticipating it. Businesses anticipating higher prices, therefore build it into their prices, and you get kind of the spiraling effect. So that's certainly part of it. The supply chain issues are certainly pushing up prices. There's a choke point of getting finished goods and intermediate goods. So businesses can't get the products they sell. They can't get the things that go into the products they sell. But there's a lot of demand out there because there's a lot of savings still built up throughout the pandemic, and wages have been growing pretty strongly. So demand is strong, especially for goods compared to services, although that's starting to shift. And so that is a real impact in the kind of real supply and demand issue. But the thing that we can't ignore when it comes to inflation is, and free market economists are fond of repeating what Milton Friedman said, that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And the Federal Reserve has added about $5 trillion to the financial system since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And that's having a real big impact on prices now. It takes a while for Fed actions to transmit into the economy, both expansionary and when they're trying to cool off growth. And get inflation under control. So that's certainly also pushing up prices at this point. Now, the Fed shifted finally this week into an anti-inflationary policy stance, but it's done so pretty slowly. So what I think you're going to see is inflation persist at very high levels. It's going to grow in March. So we're at 7.9% as of February. I thought that was probably going to be the top if we talked a couple of weeks ago. Now I don't think so. I think you're going to see inflation pushing into the middle 8% range, and maybe even higher, because gas prices have gone up so much here in March, gas and energy prices. And then Matthew touched on this, but housing prices are going to start to be reflected in the CPI numbers. And so it's going to take a while for the Fed's policy stance, anti-inflationary policies to take effect. So I think we're looking at pretty high inflation through the middle of this year. Hopefully it gets down to the 4% range. I had been saying I thought we'd get between 3 and 4% inflation by the end of 2022. I don't think that anymore. In part because the Fed changed its forecast to be 4.1% inflation for the year, and they've been undershooting inflation for over a year now. So if they think it's going to be 4.1%, I think it's probably going to be higher than that by the end of the year. And why inflation matters so much for businesses, it just makes planning very difficult. If prices are rising, it makes it really hard to plan your prices, to plan what your input prices are going to be. It puts pressure on profit margins when you cannot necessarily pass on the full cost of the rise in your inputs. And it makes all that uncertainty and makes an already difficult business situation even more difficult.
Absolutely. So let's kind of bring it down to the local level. Here in Jefferson County, between 2018 and 2021, restaurants saw a decrease of over 15%, or over 3,000 jobs just in Jefferson County alone. Oil and gas certainly saw a decrease of 1,322 across the state during the same time frame. And we've heard so much about the Great Resignation that has challenged businesses' ability to be able to find and retain the key employees that they need. Tyson, you mentioned this when you were doing your initial conversation for us. You talked about the competition that you have right now for drivers and admin staff. Tell us what this lack of employees in some of the key roles for your industry have meant as it relates to inflation.
Yeah, staffing has been a challenge. What has happened for us is we've had to increase wages, increase any benefits that are available in order to attract drivers. especially because without the drivers, we're obviously not getting the product to anybody. We really have been looking at maintaining our driving staff as well, and so that plays into it too. I just think, unfortunately, with the lack of people out there, and sometimes I would have 4 or 5 interviews scheduled and nobody would show up. That it's just been a real challenge, and people will leave for 50 cents to $1, which sometimes amazes me. So it's impacted how we plan, how we deliver, how we schedule. It's really affected a lot of the areas of our company.
Certainly had made it complicated. Sean, talk to us from the restaurant industry perspective. You've had to get pretty creative with your industry has had to get pretty creative with staffing in light of inflation and what we've seen. Tell me about the impact on the restaurant industry.
Sure. One of the issues that create some challenges for us during the pandemic is there were so many more restrictions on immigration and the flow of workers coming into our country. And that's really put a lot of pressure on the restaurant industry. And as a result of that, we've seen a lot of advances in technology that's now become more affordable, with people using mobile devices or handheld ordering devices at the table to reduce the number of steps they need in order to serve guests. In the past, our business model was typically a server would take care of 4 or 5, sometimes 6 tables at the most. Now we're in a situation where our servers have to be able to serve 10 to 12 tables at a time. Because we just don't have enough bandwidth or not enough employees to cover the rest of the restaurant. So using some of that technology has really kind of helped advance that effort and reduce our dependency on that hourly labor. And now there's newer technologies that are coming out with automatic cooking procedures, pre-made items that are maybe just being reheated, but still withhold a good quality product. And really kind of pivoting the menu and figuring out where we can get the best margins from the products that we're selling. So you see a lot of changes in the products that are being offered in a lot of restaurants, just so they can increase the profitability from that perspective.
So finding some efficiencies too is helping you mitigate the impact of inflation.
Yeah, because we can only raise prices so much before people can't afford to come out and eat anymore. Because as in the presentation, it was so brilliantly illustrated how our economy is constantly expanding and contracting. But if people don't have the disposable income to enjoy a meal out at a restaurant, or to go out to the movies, or to enjoy family vacations and those sort of things, it really doesn't matter what we do if we don't have the customers. So we have to make sure that we're keeping that pricing in a range that the consumer is willing to pay, so that we're offering good value for the products that we're offering.
Perfect. Curtis, I'm going to toss this one over to you. Talk to us from more of a national and broader business perspective. What does the lack of employees and talent, the Great Resignation, what impact is the shortage of employees having on inflation?
Oh, it's having a big impact on inflation. And Matt, to touch on this, the spirals that can occur, there's something known as a wage price spiral. And when prices are rising, employees are asking for higher wages, and that can put upward pressure on inflation. But separate from that, workers are demanding, as we just heard, much higher wages to come into the labor market. And when that happens, businesses have to pay more to compete for scarce labor. And so all the power is on the labor side right now. Businesses have to pay those higher wages. So I used to talk a lot about the $15 minimum wage and why that would be a bad thing. That's over. There's no one working for less than $15 an hour right now anywhere across the country. And so businesses really don't get in the situation where they don't have a choice. They have to pay higher wages to get workers in, because not only workers have a lot of savings. There's been a lot of government support for the pandemic, so they don't necessarily have to work. So you're competing against not working, but you're also competing against your competitors, and they're paying those higher wages. This really got driven home. And over the summer, we were up in Northwest Michigan picking up our oldest son from camp, and I saw McDonald's and a Burger King next to each other. They were both offering $15 an hour. And it dawned on me that, well, that's going to put upward pressure on wages, obviously, because no one's going to go work for the other place unless they're also paying $15 an hour. But that means that whoever moved first, the other one had to move at the same time, and they had to pay everyone else that was already working there $15 an hour, and then anyone who was at $15 or around it had to go up proportionally as well. So that's why you see the cost of labor going up so much. Those are the factors that are pushing it up. It won't last forever. It wasn't that long ago that the shoe was on their foot, that employees didn't have so much leverage. If you go back to the Great Recession, when unemployment was high, this will shift over time. But for the foreseeable future, right now, there's 4.75 million more job openings than there are workers available to fill those jobs. It's not that quantity, that absolute amount is so large. It's kind of hard to get our minds around, because it's the other way. Usually there's more workers available than there are job openings. To have the ratio inverted and then the magnitude be so high is just something that is a major problem for the economy. And it's other than inflation, the main thing we have to tackle. And the last thing I'll say is that this was an issue. So maybe you didn't have an issue where you had more job openings than available workers, but employers, businesses could not get the employees they needed because they didn't have the skills they needed to fill their positions. So we have a worker shortage and a skill shortage that existed pre-COVID and will exist post-COVID as well. And it's something we need to be focusing on from a public policy standpoint in a big way.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. So I'm going to take this next question back to the local level once again, to Sean and Tyson. We're going to stay on this theme of employment for a moment and attracting and retaining talent. Certainly, Tyson, you were talking a moment ago about folks leaving for just a small amount of increase in their wages. So Tyson, first to you and then to Sean. Regarding staffing issues, certainly the upward pressure on wages, maybe creating loyalty. What are the other things that you're doing to be creative in employee retention?
Well, you have to be creative to retain employees these days. Obviously, something that affects everybody is we've increased our wages by more than 1.1 million this year, and that's just increases. That's a staggering number to increase. We've relooked at all of our benefit packages and how we match and how we operate those, and we've made changes to those as well. We do try to maintain more of a family atmosphere in our company because it's not a large company. So what we've done is we've increased meeting times in which we see, okay, what's happening within our communities? How are the drivers doing? How are the admin staff doing? How are sales force doing? How can we assist you? There are different intangible kind of ways in which they feel more connected then. So it's really trying to make a holistic approach to maintaining a happy workforce. So.
Perfect. Sean, what are you guys doing in the restaurant and hospitality industry for employee retention, loyalty, things like that?
Yeah, so employee engagement is really a big piece of that. I mean, we really have to talk with our employees and find out what it is they want. Everybody's motivated a little bit differently. And I think lately we've seen a lot of the younger employees that we have that really value the ability to have a flexible schedule and be able to travel. And so we've looked at things so where, if we have a corporate credit card with mileage, can we find a way to disperse that mileage to our employees to help them pay for some of their travel costs? Things that we never would have considered, 2 or 3 years ago. It wouldn't make any sense. But now we have to get creative in how we deliver on those benefits for our employees and make it worthwhile to them to where they're not going to just leave us for the next restaurant down the street over 50 cents an hour. We also look at, tuition reimbursement programs. We look at, paid time off is another big key point for people right now. Looking out for health benefits for our employees, obviously, has been important to us for a number of years. But now we're also looking at the mental health aspect of it. And sometimes those things that the insurance companies don't cover, how can we help our employees make sure they're getting the mental health treatments that they need? So we've looked at a lot of different avenues, and we're still trying to figure out how we solve this problem, but we are definitely working on it.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. Curtis, I'm going to give you a two-part question here to help us kind of explore from a national perspective. Give us, number one, would you give us some advice for businesses that are attempting to sort of navigate the impacts of inflation? We heard a handful of recommendations or ideas, I guess, from Mr. Kukla, reducing costs and all of those other things that we're discussing here at a local level. But as businesses try to get creative about how they how they navigate the impacts of inflation, what recommendations do you have? And then right behind that, if you'll tackle a question that came from one of our participants today, what do you think is the first step in the right direction to increase our pool of employees?
Sure.
So Curtis, over to you.
Sure. I'll take the second one first.
Okay.
So when it comes to increasing the pool of employees, there aren't all that many options. One is immigration. We need to bring more workers into the country to help fill the gap. And high skilled workers are really what we need. So that's one area. But then it's education and getting people the skills they need early on so they can fill the job openings of the 21st century. Those two things are really what's necessary. And having a public policy system that encourages work rather than not working. There are arguments in both directions, but I certainly think over the last couple of years we've tilted in a way where the incentives are tilted towards not working, and that probably will change post-pandemic. But it's really hard for businesses to compete in the environment right now, especially when the government will give you essentially a universal basic income is almost what we've set up during COVID times. When you're competing in the market, and then you're also competing against somewhat generous government benefits, it can get really hard, and that's why we get the shrinkage of the labor force. So those three things: the immigration, education, and making sure public policy doesn't tilt against working. It's at least neutral. On the inflation side, I would say that the thing to do is be nimble. Inflation is going to bounce around, but here's the thing: I think it's going to be high for the foreseeable future. So if you can lock in cost and make those certain for the next 2 years or so, I think you'll be ahead of the game. So here's what I think is going to happen. I think you're going to see inflation remain in that 8 to 9% range in the next couple of months. For March, April, and May, it'll come down through the rest of the year. But not to that 2% target the Fed has, and not anywhere close to it. So we're going to be above 4% when we get into 2022, and then that's going to probably persist through 2022. Come down closer to 2% throughout the course of next year, and then maybe by 2023 we're back in that target range of 2%. But that's a long time from now, and I don't think we're going back below 2%. So we'll be bouncing around from 2 to 3% because of all that liquidity the Fed put in. And the lags when it comes to monetary policy. You're looking at a prolonged period of inflation that we haven't seen since the early 80s. So locking in prices now, which is hard with the supply chain as it is, I think is smart. If you can make sure that the price increases remains below that kind of 4 to 5%, I think you'll be ahead of the game.
Perfect. Well, certainly we could go on and on for so much more time in tackling all of the components of this. In fact, inflation has even had an effect on certainly commercial business, but also the nonprofit community. We didn't even get a chance to talk about that impact. The nonprofit community perhaps doesn't have the same access that commercial businesses do, like raising prices. And philanthropic donations, I think, are frequently put on hold, as one of our participants mentioned in the Q&A box. But we're approaching the top of the hour, and I want to thank so much all of our panelists for joining us today. Matthew Kukla, so grateful to have your presentation as a way of kind of opening up and understanding and trying to get our brains around this really, really important topic. On behalf of the Arvada Chamber of Commerce, we want to certainly extend our thanks to everyone that joined us for this emerging conversation today. And we want to invite you to join us for the State of the City address that's coming up in person on April 18th. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today.